A cabin stands cold on the Tow River, its hearth raked over, and a young wife swears her husband simply walked away into the winter woods. This is the true story of Frankie Silver. To understand what happened in that cabin, you have to understand the country it sat in. The Tow River Valley runs through the far western mountains of North Carolina, up in the Blue Ridge, where the ridges fold one behind the other, and the hollers stay in shadow until nearly noon. In 1831, this was the extreme western edge of Burke County. Later, in 1861, the land would be cut away into Mitchell County, and the little settlement there would come to be called Kona. But in the year our story begins, it was simply remote. It was corn patches clinging to steep ground, log cabins with stone chimneys, and men who hunted the ridges for game because the ground alone would not feed a family. Two families held that valley between them, and they were tangled together by blood and marriage, the way mountain clans always were. There were the Silvers, and there were the Stewarts. The Silvers were the larger clan. Old Jacob Silver was the head of them, and his people would come to fill a churchyard. To this day, 38 Silvers lie buried in the cemetery at Kona Baptist Church. The Stewarts were fewer. There was the father, Isaiah Stewart, the mother, Barbara Howell Stewart, and a grown son named Blackston. Now, out of those two families came a marriage, the way you would expect. Charles Silver, whom everyone called Charlie, was Jacob's boy, born around 1812, and he married a Stewart girl named Frances, though nobody in that valley ever called her Frances. They called her Frankie. She was young, born in 1814 or 15, the record is not certain which. She could neither read nor write, which was no shame and no surprise in that country. Plenty of grown people in those mountains never saw the inside of a schoolhouse. Remember that she could not read or write. Long after everything else in this story is settled, that one plain fact will still matter. Charlie and Frankie lived in a small one-room cabin near his people, with a hearth at one end and not much else. And by the winter of 1831, they were not two, but three. A daughter had been born to them on the 3rd of November, 1830, a baby girl named Nancy. So picture it, a young husband, barely 19, a young wife, 17 or so, a baby not yet walking, a log cabin on a cold river, 50 or 60 miles of hard mountain from the nearest courthouse. That courthouse sat east, over the ridges, in a town called Morganton, the seat of Burke County. 50 or 60 miles does not sound far to us now. In those mountains, in winter, on foot or by wagon, it was a punishing journey of days. Hold on to that distance. It shaped everything that came after. It shaped the search. It shaped the arrests. And it shaped the crowd that would one day gather to watch a young woman die. That was the world. A close world, a hard world, a world where everyone was somebody's cousin, and the law lived a 2-day walk away. It was the kind of place where a man could go missing, and it might be a while before anyone thought to ask hard questions. And in the last days of December 1831, Charlie Silver went missing. What happened inside that cabin on or about the 22nd of December is the darkest part of this story, and it is also the part this account will not linger on. Charlie Silver was killed with an axe. His body was then dismembered and burned in and around the cabin. That is the whole of it, stated plainly, and it is all that needs to be said of the act itself. The horror of this case does not live in the details of that night. It lives in everything that came after. And that is where we are going. Because at first, there was no crime at all. There was only a young wife with a story. Charlie had gone off, Frankie said. He had left, maybe to a neighbor's, maybe to town for the Christmas season. Men did travel, and for a few days, that was enough. But Charlie did not come back. And the Silvers were not a family to let one of their own simply vanish. Days passed, and unease set in, and old Jacob Silver and the neighbors began to do the thing mountain communities did when one of their own was lost. They formed a search party. There was no sheriff standing by, no detective, no investigation in any sense we would know. There were only neighbors walking the frozen ground, calling a man's name into hollers that gave nothing back. Here the story picks up a thread that the mountains have never let go of, and honesty requires me to tell it to you the way the mountains tell it, as a story and not as a fact. The tale goes that the search was faltering, that no one knew where to look, until an enslaved man at the home of a Colonel Williams took a glass ball, a divining ball, and used it to conjure the direction of the missing man. And the ball, the story says, pointed back to the cabin. Now, I give you that the way it has always been given, as what folks said, not as what happened. Belief in conjuring and in the finding of lost things by such means ran deep in that country. But the plain truth is simpler and colder. Sooner or later, the search came back to the cabin. It always does. And at the cabin, the searchers began to notice things. They stirred the ashes in the fireplace, and the ashes were greasy, greasier than wood ash has any right to be. In and around that hearth, they found what searchers pray they will never find: charred bone, traces of blood, and a small piece of iron that Frankie herself had once identified as the heel plate from Charlie's hunting boot. A hunting boot. In these mountains, a man's hunting gear was as much a part of him as his own hands, and here was a piece of it in the ashes of his own fire. The valley had its answer. Charlie Silver had not walked away into the winter woods. Charlie Silver had never left the cabin at all. What came next came fast, though the wheels of the law had to turn across those 50 hard miles. In the last days of December and the first days of January 1832, 3 people were arrested: Frankie, her mother Barbara, and her brother Blackston. Her father, Isaiah, was implicated too. The whole notion, you understand, was that a slight young woman could not have done such a thing alone, that family must have helped her hide it. But the case against the mother and brother did not hold. Barbara and Blackston each pleaded not guilty, and each was discharged. When the grand jury was done, only one name remained on the indictment for murder: Frances Silver, Frankie, 17 or 18 years old, and standing alone. They took her east, over the mountains, to the jail at Morganton to wait for the March term of the Burke County Superior Court. And it is here, in that courthouse, that this stops being a story about a killing in a cabin and becomes something larger and, in its own quiet way, far more troubling. Because the trial of Frankie Silver was not a fair fight. It was not even close, and the reason why is written into the law of North Carolina itself. The law of North Carolina in 1832 followed the old rules of English common law, and one of those rules stood over this whole trial like a shadow. Under that law, a person accused of a crime was considered an incompetent witness. That is the legal term, and it does not mean what it sounds like. It did not mean Frankie was thought too foolish to speak. It meant that the accused, by law, was not allowed to take the stand and testify in her own defense. The one person in that courtroom who knew what had happened inside that cabin was the one person the law forbade to say it. Frankie Silver could not tell her side. Not to the judge, not to the jury, not to anyone. The law sealed her lips before the trial ever began. So think about what that courtroom actually was. The March term of the Burke County Superior Court opened in Morganton in 1832. Presiding was Judge John R. Donnell, a Superior Court judge with the full weight of the state behind him. For the defense, a lawyer named Thomas Worth Wilson stood up and entered the only plea the law would really let him enter: not guilty. Associated with the case as well was another attorney, Nicholas Woodfin, a name that will come back to us. As for the man who prosecuted her on behalf of the state, the record has lost his name, and this account will not put a name where the record has none. The trial ran about 2 days. It began on the 29th of March, and by the record, even the jury struggled. 12 men, and they did not find it easy. At one point, they came back uncertain, and the judge gave them further instruction and sent them back. And on the 30th of March, 1832, the jury of 12 returned and gave their verdict: guilty. Judge Donnell pronounced the sentence the law demanded for murder: death by hanging. Now hold that verdict in your mind and set beside it something the clerk of that very court wrote down. The clerk's name was B.S. Gaither, and Gaither sat close to all of it. And Gaither recorded his own belief that there was strong evidence Charlie Silver had abused his young wife. More than that, Gaither believed that if Frankie had been able to stand up, admit the killing, and plead that she had done it to save her own life, she probably would have been found not guilty. Self-defense. Understand what the clerk of court was saying. The man whose whole working life was watching trials believed this trial had likely convicted a woman the law would have freed if only the law had let her speak. But it would not let her speak, and so she did not. That is the heart of this case, and it is why this trial has been called the darkest in these mountains. Not for the axe, for the silence. The defense did not simply accept the verdict. They carried the case up. An appeal was taken to the Supreme Court of North Carolina, and the record of it was filed under Judge Donnell's hand on the 3rd of May, 1832. But the High Court in June affirmed the conviction. The verdict stood. The sentence stood. Every legal door that could be tried was tried, and every one of them closed. That left one door only: mercy. Not from the courts now, but from the governor. If stories like this one from the mountains stay with you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. It costs you nothing, and it keeps cases like Frankie Silver's from slipping out of memory the way the record so nearly let them. And so began the strangest and, in some ways, the most hopeful chapter of the whole affair, because the people of Burke County did not all of them want this hanging. Petitions began to move. Dozens of them, letters and pleas for pardon or for a lighter sentence, all traveling east to the desk of Governor Montford Stokes, who held the office in 1831 and 32. And here is the fact that lands hardest of all. The petitions did not only come from strangers and neighbors. By the tradition of the case, 7 of the 12 jurors, 7 of the very men who had voted her guilty, signed their names to ask that her life be spared. 7 of 12. More than half the jury that condemned her turned around and begged the state not to carry out its own sentence. Governor Stokes, the story goes, felt his hands were tied. He is said to have answered that he could grant a pardon only if all 12 jurors agreed. Not 7, all 12, and that unanimous consent never came. Then Stokes left office, and in December of 1832, a new governor took his chair, David L. Swain. Swain was, by the accounts, sympathetic to her. He is said to have felt the pull of the case, the youth of the woman, the doubt hanging over it all. But sympathy is not a pardon. When it came to it, Swain declined to intervene. The execution would go forward. But before the state could carry out its sentence, Frankie Silver did something no one seems to have expected of a slight young woman in a mountain jail. She got out. In 1833, before the day set for her hanging, Frankie escaped the Morganton jail. Someone came in through a basement window with a set of false keys, and she went out into the night. She did not go alone, and she did not go far. What the tradition tells us of the escape carries the flavor of a tale told many times, so I give it to you as that. The story holds that when they found her, about a week later, over in Rutherford County, she was walking behind her father's wagon, her hair cut short, dressed in men's clothing so as to pass unnoticed on the road. Whether every detail of that disguise is exactly true, the record cannot fully swear, but the shape of it is well attested. She was out for roughly a week. She was taken again in Rutherford County, and she was brought back to Morganton to wait out the last of her days. Her father, Isaiah, and by one account an uncle as well, were arrested for their part in getting her free, charged as accessories to the escape. The family had closed ranks around her one final time, and one final time it was not enough, which brings us to the 12th of July, 1833, a Friday. On that morning, they brought Frankie Silver out to be hanged at Morganton before a crowd that mountain memory has never stopped counting. The traditional figure, the one repeated for nearly 2 centuries, is 10,000 people. Now, no one stood at the edge of that crowd with a tally, and no official count was ever made. So take the 10,000 as the number the mountains have always said, rather than a number anyone truly reckoned. But even if the tradition swelled it, the truth beneath it is plain enough. People came from all over that country, walking and riding for days, because a public hanging in those years was an event, a thing a whole region turned out for. And a young woman going to the gallows drew them in numbers the little town of Morganton had rarely seen. Even the place of it comes down to us in 2 versions, and honesty keeps both. One account sets the gallows behind the Burke County Courthouse in the town itself. Another places it a little way off, at a rise called Damon's Hill, off what is now Valdez Avenue. The record holds them side by side, and this account will not pretend to settle what the sources leave open. Of the hanging itself, there is nothing this telling will describe, and nothing that needs describing. She was hanged that Friday, the 12th of July, and she was 18 years old, or near enough. Those who wrote of her called her little, and one description that came down the years called her a bright-eyed, very pretty little woman. That is how the crowd would have seen her in her last hour. Young and small and silent, still barred by the law from the one thing she had never been allowed to do, which was to speak for herself. There is a moment the tradition preserves from the foot of the gallows, and it belongs to her father. As Frankie stood there, the story goes, Isaiah Stewart called out to his daughter through the crowd, "Die with it in you, Frankie. 4 words, if the tradition has them right, and they have been read 100 ways ever since. A father telling his child to carry her secret to the grave. A father telling her to keep her silence to the last. The words are handed down as tradition, not set down as verbatim record, so I give them to you the way they have always been given, as what folks said Isaiah cried out on the worst morning of his life. There is one more thing the tradition puts at that gallows, and it deserves a careful hand. The story is often told that Frankie read or recited a confession from the scaffold, a long, mournful ballad of her own sorrow and her own guilt, and here the record and the tale part weighs in a manner that goes to the very center of who this woman was, because Frankie Silver could not read, she could not write. That was true on the day she married, it was true through her trial, and it was true on the day she died. A woman who never learned her letters could not have read a written confession to a crowd. The ballad that the country would sing about Frankie Silver, the confession that would be laid in her mouth for generations, is now generally credited not to her at all, but to a Morganton schoolteacher named Thomas W. Scott. There was, years later, a printed confession to run in a newspaper called the Southern Citizen out of Asheboro in 1837, and even its standing as her true words has been argued over ever since. So, set this down plainly. The song that carries her name across the mountains was almost certainly not hers. The woman herself, the law kept quiet in life, and after her death, other hands wrote the words the world would remember her by. Now, there is a claim that has clung to Frankie Silver for as long as the ballad has, and it needs correcting because it is repeated as fact when it is not one. You will hear it said that Frankie Silver was the first woman hanged in North Carolina. Some soften it and say the first white woman. The plain trouble with the grander version is that it is not true. She was not even the first woman hanged in Burke County itself. 20 years before her, in 1813, an enslaved woman named Betsy was hanged in that same county, put to death as an accomplice. So, when you hear the claim, hear it as what tradition has always liked to say about Frankie Silver, and not as documented history. Even the more careful phrase, the first white woman executed in North Carolina, is disputed by those who have studied it closest. After the hanging, the mountains took their dead back and buried them, and even the burying leaves us with questions. Charlie Silver was laid to rest at the Kona Baptist Church Cemetery, near his people in the valley where he was born. But his grave there is not one grave. It is marked by 3 separate headstones, 3 stones for one man. The reason is grim and simple and human all at once. His remains had been recovered from that cabin in stages at different times, and it was thought improper to open a grave once it was closed, and so he was buried more than once, in more than one place in that churchyard, and 3 markers stand today over what was gathered of him. Those 3 stones on the sloping hillside behind the church are, in a real sense, the truest surviving witness to this whole case, and people still climb up to Kona to stand before them. Frankie's grave lies far from his. She was buried near Morganton, almost 60 miles from the valley she was born in, from the river and the ridges, and the only world she had ever known. And where exactly she lies is itself contested. Some accounts put her in an unmarked grave behind an old place called the Buckhorn Tavern. Others name the DeVault family cemetery. Others still say Quaker Meadows Cemetery. The stone that now bears her name is not from her own century at all. It was placed in 1952, a granite memorial set there by a woman named Beatrice Cobb. And in a last small irony fit for this whole story, the stone that was meant to honor her gets her name wrong. It spells it Silvers, with an S on the end that was never rightly there. And what of the baby? The infant daughter, Nancy, born that November of 1830, who had been in the cabin through all of it and had lived. Nancy Silver survived. She was taken in and raised by relatives, the way the mountains always absorbed their orphaned children, passed into the care of kin and grown up in that same close country. She is the one thread of this story that reaches quietly forward into ordinary life. A child who outlived both her parents and the whole terrible business of that winter, and carried the name down into years that had nothing to do with gallows or ballads. The song, though, would not let the case rest, and neither in time would the historians. For well over a century, the story of Frankie Silver survived the way so much survives in these mountains, in a ballad sung from memory, handed down from voice to voice. The tune traveled the hollers and the church suppers and the front porches, carried by the tradition bearers who keep such songs alive, singers like Bobby McMillan in our own era, whose telling of it a folklorist named Daniel W. Patterson set down in a book called A Tree Accursed. For generations, that ballad was most of what people knew of Frankie Silver. A tragic wife, a confessed killer, a mournful song. The verdict of 1832, set to music and sung as settled truth. But the record kept its own counsel, waiting in the courthouses and the archives for someone to go looking. And in 1963, someone did. A writer named Perry Dean Young found the old petitions and the letters that had been sent to the governor, the very pleas that 7 jurors and their neighbors had signed all those years before. And what Young read in those papers changed the story for him for the rest of his life. He came to believe that Frankie Silver had been unjustly hanged, that the mountain valley had put to death a young woman who, given a fair hearing and a voice of her own, might never have swung at all. Young spent decades on it. He wrote a book, The Untold Story of Frankie Silver, and he helped write a stage play, simply called Frankie, that reached the theater in 2001. He became, in effect, the advocate the woman herself was never allowed to be in that courtroom. And he was not alone in the reappraisal. Scholars turned back to the case not to retry the killing, but to weigh the trial. The killing itself is not truly in dispute. Frankie Silver was convicted, and convicted she remains. What the modern reading raises, carefully and as a modern reading rather than a proven fact, is the question the clerk of court had raised in his own hand back in 1832. Whether a frightened young wife, if the abuse he described was real, had struck to save her own life. That is the battered wife reading of the case, and it rests not on invention, but on what Geither wrote, and on what those petitions suggested to the people closest to it. It cannot be proven now. It could not be proven then, because the one witness who could have spoken to it was forbidden to speak. But it is why petitions for a pardon are raised for Frankie Silver still, nearly 2 centuries after her death, and why her name comes up whenever North Carolina reckons with the long history of who its law protected and who it did not. Because look at what the law itself did after her. The rule that silenced her, the rule that made a defendant an incompetent witness in her own trial, did not stand forever. In 1859, North Carolina changed it. From that year on, a person accused of a crime could choose to take the stand and testify, while keeping the right to stay silent if they wished. 26 years too late for Frankie Silver. Had she stood trial a generation later on the very same facts, in the very same courthouse, she could have climbed into that witness box, faced the 12 men, and told them what happened in the cabin and why. The jury that struggled to convict her might have heard in her own voice the very thing the clerk believed would have set her free. The only thing that stood between Frankie Silver and that chance was time. She was born a few decades too early for the law to let her speak, so return at the last to that cabin on the Tow River, cold and quiet in the winter of 1831, and to the young wife who swore her husband had simply walked away. The law never let her say more than that. It sealed her lips in the courtroom, and the grave sealed them for good, and the words the world remembers her by were written by another hand entirely, a woman who could not read made famous by a song she could not have penned. Her husband lies under 3 stones on a hillside at Kona, gathered back to his people. She lies alone near Morganton, almost 60 miles from home, beneath a marker that got there 119 years late and spelled her name wrong when it came. Between those 2 graves is the whole of it, a killing no one denies, and a question the trial would never let her answer. And so the darkest thing about the trial of Frankie Silver was never the axe, nor the ashes, nor the crowd on the hill. It was the silence the law demanded of her, kept all the way to the end.